Imagine like waking up, grabbing your phone right off the nightstand, and realizing that while you were totally asleep, 100,000 strangers decided they know your identity way better than you do.
Ugh. Literal nightmare scenario.
Right. You try to tell them, like, no, you've got this completely wrong. I'm literally just a guy who went to work today.
And they just ignore it.
Completely. They respond by virtually burning your entire digital life to the ground, mass reporting your accounts, screaming at you to just accept the label that they've arbitrarily assigned to you.
It sounds like a bad dystopian sci-fi movie.
Yeah, it really does.
Uh-huh.
But it's actually just a random Tuesday on the modern internet.
Yeah.
So today we're bringing you to the table for a deep dive into a single hyper-reactive live stream that basically broke the internet's brain.
And the reason we really want to bring this specific digital mob to you today is because it just perfectly exposes this massive flaw in how we all communicate right now.
Oh, absolutely.
We are doing a deep dive into a very specific, honestly, incredibly challenging piece of source material. It tackles the modern culture wars surrounding, well, LGBTQIA plus identities.
Right.
And the author basically uses this exact internet train wreck to prove that we don't even know what we're actually fighting about anymore. But before we get into the actual mechanics of all this, we have to lay down a super firm boundary for how we're approaching the deep dive today.
Yeah, that is critical because the text we're unpacking today is written from a highly specific, very personal vantage point. The author explicitly identifies as a Christian who holds very traditional views on sexuality and gender. So just to be fully transparent with you about the text's baseline right off the bat, the author operates from a religious worldview that firmly believes homosexual acts are morally wrong.
Right, and we need to make this crystal clear to you listening right now out of the gate. We are absolutely not taking sides today.
Not at all.
We're not here to, endorse that theological viewpoint, and we aren't here to condemn it either or, play political referee.
Exactly. Our singular mission for this deep dive is to impartially report on and just deeply dissect the ideas, the inherent tensions, and the sociological arguments that are presented in this text.
Yep.
We want you to understand how an author who is starting from that traditional conservative baseline is actively attempting to build a bridge across an incredibly hostile societal divide.
Right. We'll be tracing a line straight from a viral dispute on a streaming app right into the biological science of human attraction.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
It really is. And then we're going into the really profound, often agonizing collisions between physical reality and religious faith.
We're also going to be navigating this super volatile debates over youth medical transition and looking at the chilling, literal life or death calculus that transgender adults have to run just to go on a simple date.
It's super heavy.
It is heavy, it's complex, and it really requires all of us to just drop our usual defenses.
So to everyone listening, consider this your invitation. Pull up a chair for the next hour. Just try to mentally unbuckle your political armor.
Put the social media talking points on silent.
Exactly. Let's just look at the raw mechanics of this cultural fracture, starting with the inciting incident the author uses to anchor this whole conversation. It all takes place on an app called BeGo Live.
Right, BeGo Live.
Yeah.
And if you aren't super familiar with the ecosystem of this app, it's really crucial to understand the environment here.
It's intense.
It's wildly intense. This is not some curated, heavily edited YouTube video where everyone is perfectly lit. It's a live streaming platform where broadcasters interact in real time with massive, completely unfiltered audiences.
Right. The comment sections move at a blistering pace.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to keep up.
Exactly. It basically bypasses the prefrontal cortex entirely. It's pure, raw, instantaneous reaction. And this one broadcaster who goes by the name BOSSMAN recently found himself at the dead center of a digital hurricane on there.
Yeah, so the source text lays out the specifics of this BOSSMAN situation. He's a public figure of sorts. He's actually done some mainstream television.
Right, like that true crime reenactment show.
Yeah, the source mentions it's possibly For My Man, specifically Season 9, Episode 10. But more recently, he did a scene in the adult film industry.
Right.
And the absolute crux of this entire sociological meltdown is that the specific scene he filmed involved a performer who happens to be transgender.
And because of that one single professional interaction, the internet mob just mobilized with terrifying speed to assign him an identity.
Overnight.
Literally overnight. People flooded his live streams, thousands of comments pouring in by the minute. Half the crowd is just aggressively calling him gay.
And the other half is calling him trans.
Right. They're just demanding that he confess to being something other than a straight man.
But he has been speaking. That's the truly wild part about all this. The text emphasizes that BOSSMAN has been explicitly, repeatedly clear about this.
Yeah, he's looking dead at the camera.
Looking right at the camera saying, I am not gay, I am not trans, I just did a job. It was literally just a professional interaction.
But the crowd has fully decided that his own words are irrelevant.
Exactly. They decided that the simple act of doing a single scene with a trans coworker somehow fundamentally and permanently alters his internal gender identity or his sexual orientation.
It's just a perfect case study in how collective outrage operates, you know? The internet comment section effectively crowned itself the supreme authority on this guy's internal life.
And it didn't even stop with him. That's the worst part.
Oh, right.
The blast radius of this kind of moral panic is just huge. The author introduces another figure who got totally caught in the crossfire. A woman connected to the situation who goes by Aaliyah the doll, where she also goes by Regina George.
The collateral damage here is staggering. I mean, she has a massive footprint, over 730,000 fans on her main page.
Over 700,000.
Yeah, but that footprint is constantly being erased. The mob is so hyper-fixated on the BOSSMAN drama that they've weaponized the platform's reporting tools against her.
That is so messed up.
They mass report her accounts, they trigger automated bans, and block her en masse. She is repeatedly forced into this digital exile, having to build new accounts entirely from scratch.
Just because the public is confused and enraged over someone else's supposed identity.
Right. And I really want to ask you about a very specific piece of the crowd's behavior here, because the author points out this fascinating quirk in the comments. The mob keeps insisting to BOSSMAN, you're either straight or gay.
Yes.
They are violently enforcing this binary. They are entirely erasing even the possibility of bisexuality. So why is the public, or I guess the internet, so incredibly hostile to the B in the acronym? Like, what makes bisexuality such a threat to them?
It really comes down to cognitive load. The human brain, particularly when it's operating in a high-anxiety, high-speed digital environment like Beagle Live, it relies super heavily on heuristics.
Mental shortcuts.
Exactly. We need mental shortcuts to process information quickly. So straight and gay function as these fixed absolute data points. They're two mutually exclusive buckets. You're in bucket A, or you are in bucket B. It makes the world feel very predictable.
Which requires zero critical thinking.
None whatsoever. But bisexuality introduces fluidity. It suggests that human attraction is a spectrum, not just a light switch.
Right.
It implies that a person could exist in multiple spaces, or that their capacity for attraction isn't bound by a rigid gender binary. And for a mob that is desperately trying to quickly judge, categorize, and execute a social verdict.
Fluidity is agonizing for them.
Agonizing. The internet prefers to force a label onto someone because it allows the mob to maintain its own intellectual laziness. If they acknowledge bisexuality, they have to acknowledge nuance.
Which perfectly sets up the author's primary thesis here. The mob isn't just lazy. They are fundamentally illiterate when it comes to the vocabulary of human identity. This entire BOSSMAN saga stems from a total public misunderstanding of basic definitions. The text argues that we're out here having these vicious, society-rending culture wars over concepts we can't even define.
We are literally arguing over the blueprints of a house when we don't even know the difference between a hammer and a nail.
That is such a good way to put it. So let's look at the foundational distinction the source text tries to establish. If you understand this one concept, the author argues, 90% of the confusion driving that Beagle Live mob just evaporates.
Let's weigh it out.
The distinction is this. Sexual orientation is about who you are attracted to. Gender identity is about who you are.
That is the bedrock. We need to pull that apart completely. Sexual orientation, words like gay, lesbian, bisexual, straight, these terms describe the outward vector of your desire.
Right.
They describe who pulls your focus. A gay man experiences outward attraction toward other men. A lesbian experiences outward attraction toward women. A bisexual person has the capacity for outward attraction to more than one gender. It is an entirely external mechanism.
Like, it's about where your compass needle points.
I like that. Yes. But transgender, which is a term of gender identity, is about the compass itself.
Oh, wow.
It describes a profound internal reality. It means that an individual's deep-seated neurological sense of their own gender just does not match the biological sex they were assigned at birth based on their anatomy.
Okay.
So a trans man is someone who was assigned female at birth, but whose authentic internal operating system is male. A trans woman was assigned male at birth, but is internally and authentically a woman. That internal reality has absolutely nothing to do with who they want to date.
Okay, let me just test this to make sure I'm completely tracking the author's logic here, because these are entirely separate axes. One is external desire, one is internal identity. That means a transgender person has a sexual orientation in the exact same way a cisgender person does.
Yes, exactly. They are completely independent variables. A trans woman, for example, is a woman. Therefore, if she's attracted exclusively to men, she's straight. If she's attracted exclusively to women, she's a lesbian.
Or she could be bisexual.
Exactly. Her transness does not dictate her orientation.
Mm.
But because society has crammed all of these super varied experiences into one single, ever-expanding acronym, LGBTQIA plus D, the general public tends to view them as a single progressive monolith.
Right, they erroneously assume that trans is just like an escalated extreme version of day.
Which is so wrong. The text actually provides this incredibly blunt analogy for this, and the author acknowledges it's a bit of an oversimplification, but it works so well.
The bed analogy.
Yes, the author says, sexual orientation is who you want to go to bed with. Gender identity is who you go to bed as.
Who you want to go to bed with versus who you go to bed as. That immediately cuts through all the academic fog.
It really does. And if we drag that analogy right back into the Bagel Live comment section, you can see the exact moment the internet's logic totally collapsed.
Right.
BOSSMAN, a cisgender man, filmed a scene with a trans woman's. The mob saw a trans person on screen and completely scrambled the categories.
They basically assumed that interacting with a transgender person professionally somehow rewrites your own internal gender identity or fundamentally changes the vector of your sexual orientation.
Which makes no sense.
None. BOSSMAN didn't change who he goes to bed as, nor did doing a job change the baseline of who he generally wants to go to bed with. But the mob, they don't care about the facts of his life.
No, they just care about the momentum of their own outrage.
Okay, so if we accept the text's premise that sexual orientation is strictly about the outward projection of desire, like who you're attracted to, the inevitable next question we have to ask is, where does that baseline attraction actually originate?
And this is where the source material takes a huge, fascinating turn. We go from digital sociology straight into human biology. We're stepping right into the decades-old debate of born this way versus choice.
Yeah.
And what's super interesting is how this conservative Christian author approaches the science.
Right. The author approaches it by looking directly at the established scientific consensus. They temporarily set their theology aside to just look at the raw physical reality. And the consensus cited in the text is unambiguous here. Sexual orientation is not a conscious choice.
Oh.
It is an involuntary biological characteristic. You do not stand in front of a mirror one morning and actively decide which gender will cause your pupils to dilate or your heart rate to elevate.
And the text makes it really clear that it's not just a single switch that gets flipped in the brain, right? It's this highly complex biological recipe.
It is. It's a profound intersection of genetics, hormonal washes, and the prenatal environment. And to illustrate how deep this biological reality really goes, the author points to a very specific, well-documented phenomenon known as the fraternal birth order effect.
Okay, I have to jump in here because I had literally never encountered this concept before reading the source material for this deep dive, and it honestly blew my mind.
It's wild, right?
It's crazy. Can you break down exactly how this mechanism works? Because it sounds almost like science fiction to me.
It's honestly one of the most fascinating discoveries in the study of human orientation. So, statistically, across massive population studies, researchers found a very consistent pattern. Having older biological brothers slightly but measurably increases the mathematical likelihood that a subsequent male child will be gay.
Wait, biological brothers specifically? What if they are adopted or stepbrothers?
That's the most crucial detail here. It only applies to biological brothers who share the exact same biological mother's womb. Stepbrothers or adopted brothers who are raised in the same house have zero effect on the statistics.
Oh my gosh.
Which proves that the cause isn't sociological. It has absolutely nothing to do with how the boys are socialized or what toys they play with or sibling dynamics. The mechanism is entirely prenatal.
So what is actually happening in the womb to cause that?
So the prevailing scientific hypothesis is rooted in maternal immunology. When a woman is pregnant with a male fetus, her body is exposed to male-specific proteins. These are antigens that are totally alien to her own female biology. In response, her immune system naturally develops antibodies against these male proteins. With her first male pregnancy, the antibody response is relatively minor, but as we know, the immune system has a memory.
Oh, so each subsequent male pregnancy, that immune response just gets stronger?
Exactly. With a second, third, or fourth male pregnancy, the mother's immune system produces a much higher concentration of these specific antibodies. These maternal antibodies actually cross the placental barrier and enter the fetal brain environment.
Wow.
The theory is that these antibodies subtly interact with and basically alter the sexual differentiation pathways in the developing fetal brain. They basically tweak the neurological architecture that will eventually govern sexual orientation long before the child is even born.
That is staggering. I mean, it completely obliterates the argument that orientation is somehow absorbed from pop culture or, peer pressure. We are talking about a cascade of immunological events happening at a microscopic level while the brain is literally still forming.
It heavily reinforces the reality that attraction is totally involuntary. But the author is extremely meticulous about not overstating the science here.
Right.
The text provides a very necessary caveat. Biology is super messy, and there is no singular magic gay gene.
Right. The author brings up those studies on identical twins to prove that genetics aren't the whole story, because identical twins share 100% of their DNA. So if sexual orientation was purely, exclusively dictated by a genetic code, then if one twin was gay, the other twin would have a guaranteed 100% probability of also being gay.
But the data shows that's not always the case.
Exactly. One twin can be gay while the other is straight.
Which tells us that while genetics absolutely load the gun, so to speak, the prenatal environment, like those hormonal washes and immune responses we just discussed, that's what pulls the trigger. But the author's ultimate conclusion remains rock solid. Whatever the precise, chaotic cocktail of genes and fetal environment happens to be, the end result is that the individual absolutely does not choose their attraction.
Okay, but this leads to a massive semantic collision. I really want to push on this.
Yeah.
Because the author points out that we routinely see people in the media, or even people in our own personal lives, explicitly use the phrase, "I chose the lifestyle."
Yes.
If the biological science universally agrees that the attraction itself isn't a choice, why are people saying that? Are they just experiencing some kind of massive internalized denial?
It's a brilliant question, and the author actually uses it to highlight a massive flaw in our cultural vocabulary. The text argues that these people are not lying, nor are they in denial. They are accurately describing their lived experience.
Really?
Yes. The problem is that society has completely conflated two very different words, attraction and lifestyle.
Oh, I see. So when someone says, "I chose the lifestyle," they mean exactly that. They chose how to live, not how to feel.
Precisely. Let's look at the specific examples the author uses to illustrate this, starting with asexuality. An asexual person, by definition, experiences little to no baseline sexual attraction. However, human beings still crave intimacy, companionship, partnership. An asexual person might make a highly conscious, deliberate choice to enter into a marriage or a lifelong partnership based purely on deep emotional resonance, shared life goals, and romantic affection.
Right.
They chose the structure of their lifestyle, they chose a partner, but they did not choose the biological absence of their sexual attraction.
That makes total sense. Or take the experience of a bisexual person, which the text also explores deeply.
Right. A bisexual person possesses the biological capacity to be attracted to multiple genders. But navigating the dating world with fluid attraction can be exhausting, right?
Yeah.
Especially when facing the kind of erasure we literally just saw in the Big O Live comments.
Oh, definitely.
So a bisexual person might make a conscious, deliberate decision to exclusively date people of the same sex. Perhaps they find the LGBTQIA+ community way more welcoming, or they feel safer from heteronormative expectations. They have actively chosen to immerse themselves in a gay lifestyle and community.
But that behavioral choice doesn't erase their underlying biological capacity for dual attraction.
It's literally the difference between hardware and software.
Oh, I love that.
You don't get to pick the operating system you were born with, right? That's the involuntary hardware of attraction. But you absolutely have agency over what programs you run, the software of your daily behavior, the communities you join, the labels you adopt.
And this specific distinction, the unchosen hardware versus the chosen software, is the exact mechanism that creates the most agonizing tension in the entire source text.
It really is.
Because if you accept that your biological attraction is unchosen and largely unchangeable, but you simultaneously hold deeply traditional religious beliefs that dictate exactly how you are supposed to live, you are caught in an existential vice grip.
Which moves us directly into the heart of the author's personal worldview. We are looking at the extreme tension between physical reality and religious faith. And again, a quick reminder to everyone listening of our impartiality rule here. We are exploring the psychological weight of the author's Christian perspective, where homosexual acts are viewed as sinful.
Oh.
The author looks at the science, totally admits the attraction isn't a choice, but still holds firm to their theological boundary regarding behavior.
It creates a staggering psychological paradox. How does a human being survive the cognitive dissonance of believing that their unchosen, involuntary biological desires are fundamentally in conflict with their eternal spiritual mandate?
It's intense, and to ground this incredibly abstract theological problem, the author brings up a very specific cultural touchstone. It was a highly controversial TLC television documentary special called My Husband's Not Gay.
Oh my gosh, I vividly remember the media firestorm when this aired. The premise alone made people absolutely furious.
It really did. The special followed the lives of several Mormon men living in Utah. And what made the show so arresting was the absolute candor of these men. They literally sat in front of the cameras next to their wives within their tight-knit communities and openly admitted that they experience primary same-sex attraction.
Wow.
They are biologically attracted to men, but driven by an incredibly profound, overriding devotion to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they actively chose not to act on that hardware.
They used their agency over their software to completely override their biological impulses.
Exactly. They made the monumental choice to marry women, to engage in heterosexual relationships, and to build traditional family structures, all in order to remain obedient to their interpretation of Scripture.
Right.
They are living, breathing embodiments of the author's distinction between unchosen attraction and chosen lifestyle.
But the author points out a totally devastating consequence of their choice. By existing in this incredibly nuanced, painful middle ground, these men effectively made themselves targets for both extremes of the culture war.
They literally have no safe harbor.
None.
It's the ultimate culture war squeeze. The text breaks down how both sides just utterly dehumanize these men. On one side, you have the secular, progressive, cultural voice. This side looks at these Mormon men and aggressively labels them as repressed, self-loathing victims of a toxic religious patriarchy.
Right.
They view the men's marriages as fraudulent and assume their lives must be this miserable, closeted lie.
And then on the other side, you have the highly conservative, fundamentalist religious voice. And arguably, their attack is even more insidious.
I'd agree.
Because they look at these exact same men who are literally sacrificing their own physical desires to follow the rules of the faith, and tell them they're still an abomination. They tell them that if their faith was truly pure, if they just prayed hard enough, the same-sex attraction would miraculously evaporate.
It is a staggering double bind of cruelty. They are making what they view as a supreme sacrifice for their God, and the secular world mocks them as cowards, while their own religious peers view them as spiritually defective. They're totally erased by the left and rejected by the right.
And this is where the author's argument really pierces through all the noise for me. The author suggests that in our current cultural climate, absolutely nobody has the patience or the empathy to just sit across from one of these men, look them in the eye and say, you know, that sounds like an incredibly heavy burden to carry. Tell me what it costs you to live like this.
Exact.
We are so desperate to use their lives as ammunition for our political arguments that we just completely strip away their fundamental humanity.
The text is ultimately issuing a desperate plea for compassion for the liminal spaces. You know, you do not have to agree with Mormon theology. You might fundamentally believe that marrying someone you aren't physically attracted to is just a recipe for disaster.
Sure.
But the author is demanding that the reader recognize the sheer agony of navigating a tension between unchosen biology and deeply chosen faith. When we dismiss these men as either jokes or failures, we are proving that our ideology matters way more to us than human beings do.
It requires the ability to hold two conflicting truths in your mind at the exact same time, respecting their biological reality, while also respecting the depth of their spiritual conviction. And as we saw with the Big O Live knob, society is violently allergic to nuance.
It really is. And that allergy to nuance becomes even more severe, and honestly, the stakes get significantly higher as the source text moves from the topic of sexual orientation back over to gender identity. We're moving from the quiet, internal agony of faith to the highly public, excruciatingly debated realm of youth medical transition.
And once again, the author anchors this complex debate in a specific cultural artifact, another TLC reality series, but this one is called I Am Jazz.
Right. And for listeners who haven't followed her story, Jazz Jennings is arguably one of the most prominent, visible transgender young people in American history. Assigned male at birth, Jazz articulated a female identity from the time she could literally form sentences. Yeah. The show documented her parents navigating this reality, ultimately supporting her through a comprehensive transition process. This started with a social transition in early childhood, changing pronouns, growing her hair out, wearing girls' clothing.
And then it escalated.
Right. It eventually escalated to a full medical transition involving puberty-blocking medications, cross-sex hormones, and multiple gender-affirming surgeries, all before she even reached adulthood.
Now, we have to pause here and impartially report exactly how the author processes this, because the author does not hide their initial visceral reaction. Operating from their traditional conservative baseline, the author openly admits to experiencing profound physical and moral disgust while watching this medical process unfold on television.
The language used in the text is intentionally jarring.
It really is. The author describes watching a child undergo repeated invasive surgeries, dealing with severe surgical complications, and permanently altering their endocrine system. The author looks at this and explicitly uses the word diabolical. They state unequivocally that they would never, under any circumstances, subject their own child to that medical pathway.
But, and this is where the text becomes genuinely remarkable, the author doesn't allow their own disgust reflex to just be the end of the thought process. They actively push through their own psychological resistance to achieve what is essentially a huge empathy breakthrough.
I want to spend some time on how that breakthrough actually happens, because the author realizes they are judging the situation from a position of massive privilege.
Exactly. The author realizes, I'm sitting here in a comfortable living room looking at my own cisgender children whose internal identities perfectly match their physical bodies. The author has the luxury of assuming that Jazz's parents were just sitting at a kitchen table, looking at a menu of options, and simply deciding between having a normal, happy child or having a transitioning child.
But the author realizes that was never the menu. That choice didn't even exist.
Right. The options on the table for Jazz's parents were terrifyingly dark. They were not choosing between a happy cisgender child and a trans child. They were choosing between a child who was in severe, clinical, life-threatening distress, battling profound dysphoria, crushing depression, and the literal statistical reality of youth suicidality.
Oh, God.
And on the other hand, a radical medical intervention that they genuinely believed was the only way to keep their child breathing.
If you're listening right now, try to put yourself in the shoes of those parents for a second. Imagine looking at your child and realizing that their internal software is violently rejecting their physical hardware. The psychological toll of feeling trapped in a body that feels like a prison is unimaginable to most of us.
It is.
The author is asking their conservative readers to stop looking at the surgeries and start looking at the absolute desperation of the parents.
And let's be super clear about what the text is not saying here. The author is not suddenly endorsing puberty blockers. The author retains massive fundamental disagreements with the medical ethics of performing these procedures on minors. But the author is demanding a shift in how we judge the people involved.
That's a crucial distinction. The text argues that you can vehemently oppose the medicine, but you must recognize the humanity of the family. Jazz's parents were not political activists trying to subvert Western civilization or destroy traditional gender roles.
No.
They were terrified parents trying to apply a tourniquet to a psychological hemorrhage. They were making agonizing, imperfect choices out of profound love and deep fear.
It perfectly mirrors the situation with the Mormon men. Jazz's parents exist in an impossible, excruciating reality, and society responds by turning them into a cable news graphic. The text is literally begging the reader to look past the political talking points and see the survival mechanisms at play.
But as the author points out, while the debate around youth transition is primarily focused on medical ethics and parental rights, the realities of adult transgender life shift into an entirely different, much darker arena.
Yeah, it really does.
It stops being a debate about medicine and becomes a raw calculation of sheer physical survival.
Which brings us to the most intense, sobering analysis in the entire source text. The author examines a scenario that every single transgender adult navigating the dating world has to face, and it involves literal life-or-death stakes. The calculus of disclosure.
Okay, so the central question is, at what exact moment does a transgender person disclose their trans status to a potential romantic partner?
Right.
Is it in the very first message on a dating app? Is it during the first cup of coffee? Do you wait a few weeks? Do you wait until physical intimacy is on the table?
I mean, it sounds like a simple question of dating etiquette, but it's actually a threat assessment.
Uh-huh.
The author unpacks the two primary strategies for disclosure, and the devastating reality is that both strategies are driven entirely by the terror of being murdered.
Let's analyze the first strategy, the argument for immediate disclosure. The protocol here is radical, immediate transparency. You put it in the very first line of your dating profile. You say it within the first 5 minutes of sitting down at a bar. You disclose before a single phone number is even exchanged.
Okay, but what is the actual survival logic behind doing it that early?
The logic is filtering out the lethal threat before it has time to arm itself.
Wow.
If a trans person waits to disclose, and in that waiting period, the cisgender partner develops romantic feelings or emotional attachment or physical attraction, when the disclosure finally happens, the cisgender partner might experience a profound sense of being deceived.
Right.
And in a society that is heavily burdened by toxic masculinity, homophobia, and transphobia, a straight cisgender man feeling that his sexuality has been tricked can instantly trigger a violent, uncontrollable, and often fatal rage. Immediate disclosure ensures the trans person never enters a private space with someone capable of that reaction.
But then, the text explores the counter-strategy, the argument for delayed disclosure. Because immediate transparency clearly carries its own terrifying risk.
Exactly. The delayed disclosure protocol says, hold the information back. Go on a few dates in public, well-lit spaces. Gauge their temperament. See how they react to minor frustrations. Assess if they are a psychologically stable human being.
Because disclosing immediately is basically handing a loaded weapon to a total stranger.
Precisely. Your transness is a highly stigmatized, deeply vulnerable piece of personal data. Transgender individuals are routinely assaulted or murdered by complete strangers simply for existing in public.
It's horrible.
If you hand that volatile information to an unstable, unpredictable stranger in the first 5 minutes of meeting them, you might be providing the exact spark needed to ignite a hate crime right there at the table. You delayed disclosure because you need time to run a behavioral background check on the person sitting across from you.
And the statistics the author includes to back up this fear are chilling. We aren't talking about hypothetical anxiety here. The text notes that 47% of transgender people report being sexually assaulted in their lifetime.
Almost half the population.
Almost half.
And dozens are murdered every single year in the United States alone. And the text makes a point to highlight that this violence disproportionately annihilates trans women of color.
And the most critical piece of data the author highlights is that the moment of disclosure, that exact fraction of a second when the truth is vocalized, is a widely documented, historically proven trigger point for lethal violence. It is literally the most dangerous moment in a trans person's life.
So, I'm looking at how the author frames this, and I really want to test the conclusion. If immediate disclosure can trigger fatal violence and delayed disclosure can trigger fatal violence, what is the moral imperative here? How is a trans person supposed to actually navigate this?
The author's profound, incredibly somber conclusion is that there is no safe answer. It is an unwinnable, terrifying game of roulette. Now, the author does maintain their conservative ethical baseline here. The text explicitly states that intentional deception leading to physical intimacy is a violation of trust and a breach of informed consent. Hiding the reality right into the bedroom is not excused.
But the real insight here is where the blame is actually placed.
Yes. The author points out that this impossible situation is not a failure of the transgender individual's morality. It is a catastrophic failure of society.
It's a societal failure.
When a marginalized person's honesty carries a lethal risk, and their caution also carries a lethal risk, society has lost the right to judge how they navigate the minefield. The author is essentially demanding that the reader stop obsessing over whether trans people are being perfectly transparent on Tinder and start asking why our culture has made the simple act of going on a date a potential death sentence.
It completely shatters the mundane concept of dating. It reveals that for an entire demographic, romance is basically indistinguishable from a hostage negotiation.
Having waded through these incredibly heavy life-or-death realities, the author uses the final section of the source text to kind of zoom out. We've looked at the Be Alive mob, the biology of the brain, the theology of the Mormon men, the desperation of youth transition, and the deadly calculus of dating.
Right.
Now, the author looks at the umbrella that covers all of this, the LGBTQIA+ acronym itself and what it actually represents in the year 2026.
This is where we tackle the constant, exhausted complaint you hear from so many people. Like, why are there so many letters now? What's the plus sign for? Why do we need a new word every single week?
The author addresses that cultural fatigue very directly. The base letters are somewhat understood: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual. But the author focuses intensely on defending the plus sign at the end. Critics often dismiss the plus sign as a progressive loophole that just means anything goes, like a catch-all for made-up internet trends.
But the text lists out several specific identities covered by that plus sign to prove they are completely legitimate categories. We have pansexual, meaning the capacity for attraction to people regardless of their biological sex or gender identity.
Right.
They are attracted to the person, not the category. Then there's non-binary, an internal identity that rejects being strictly categorized as exclusively male or exclusively female. Demisexual, which is a specific orientation where a person literally cannot experience sexual attraction until a deep, profound emotional bond has been established.
The test also mentions aromantic, people who experience little to no romantic attraction, even if they experience sexual attraction. And two-spirit, which is a deeply historical umbrella term used by some indigenous North American cultures to describe a traditional third gender or spiritual role within their societies.
The author's whole purpose in defining these terms is to combat the idea that this is all a modern invention. The text argues fiercely that these identities are not fads cooked up by teenagers trying to be edgy on TikTok. They are not linguistic trends. They are real, tangible, historically documented patterns of human experience.
They've literally always been here.
They have existed in every civilization since the dawn of humanity. The only difference is that in 2026, we finally possess the global connectivity and the specific vocabulary to accurately describe them. Dismissing these words as a joke or a burden is just another manifestation of the internet mob's desire to erase nuance. Refusing to learn the language is a deliberate choice to refuse to see the human being standing right in front of you.
Which brings us to the grand overarching thesis of this entire document. When you synthesize all of this, from the digital exile of Aaliyah the doll, to the unchosen antibodies in the womb, to the sacrifices of faith, to the threat of violence, what is the author's ultimate diagnosis of our culture?
The thesis is basically a desperate call for a societal ceasefire. The author posits a surprisingly optimistic view of humanity. Most people are not actually bigots.
Exactly.
The people swarming BOSSMAN's comments or expressing deep anxiety over youth transition, the vast majority of them are not hateful monsters acting out of malice. They're just incredibly overwhelmed. The societal paradigms are shifting faster than their nervous systems can process, and they're reacting out of disorientation and sheer fear.
And the text points out the corollary to that. Most LGBTQIA+ people are not radical, subversive activists actively plotting to dismantle Western civilization or destroy the nuclear family. They're just regular human beings. They want to feel comfortable in their own skin, they want to love who they love, and they want the luxury of buying groceries without being turned into a political debate.
The true villain in the author's eyes is the machinery of outrage. The social media algorithms, the hyper-partisan political pundits, the 24-hour rage-bait news cycle. These entities have successfully convinced the exhausted middle that the other side is pure existential evil.
Because they profit off the division.
Exactly. The platforms profit immensely when we scramble the definitions of sexual orientation and gender identity, because the resulting confusion generates endless, highly monetizable arguments in the comment sections. Outrage is literally the most profitable commodity on earth.
So, to synthesize the massive journey this author has taken us on today, we started by looking at BOSSMAN on Bigo Live, which proved that our culture is violently illiterate when it comes to basic definitions.
Right.
We dove into the science to realize that the hardware of attraction is forged in the womb and completely unchosen, even if the software of our lifestyle is. We explored the crushing cognitive dissonance of the Mormon men trying to honor both their biology and their God. We looked at the agonizing, survival-based decisions made by the parents of trans youth, like Jazz Jennings, and we confronted the grim, terrifying reality that for trans adults, simply telling the truth on a date can be a fatal decision.
And the final, impartial takeaway we must draw from this specific author, a conservative Christian holding traditional views, is this vital lesson. You do not have to affirm everything to understand it. You can hold your religious boundaries with absolute firmness. You can profoundly disagree with medical interventions, and you can reject certain lifestyle choices. But you can do all of that while still treating the human being standing in front of you with unwavering dignity. You can disagree with someone's reality without demanding their destruction.
Which leaves me with a final thought for you to carry with you as you log off today. It's a thought that really builds on the author's diagnosis of the outrage machine. If the tech monopolies and the political extremes are literally padding their bottom lines by ensuring we remain confused, angry, and terrified of each other, what happens if we rebel?
Hmm.
What if the most radical, disruptive act of cultural defiance you can perform today is simply choosing to close the comments section, sit quietly, and actually listen to someone whose life makes absolutely no sense to you? Who profits when we finally take the time to understand each other?
We all do. The machine loses, and we win.
A quiet rebellion of empathy.
Thank you so much for pulling up a chair today, for leaving your armor at the door, and for navigating this incredibly complex deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.